Hi everyone, it's Ellie from The Curious Geographer, and welcome to our new kind of term series of interviews for 2021. So hope you are all well, and if you haven't had a look at the upcoming poster, then there is a QR code. My pink finger's not pointing very well to it, over in the top corner, so you can have a look to see what's coming up. A bit of a shorter term, one every other week, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. So every other Tuesday at 5 p.m. So definitely check that out. There's some really, really good guests and very global around the world. But if we go on to today's interview, we are joined by Lewis Dartnell. So Professor Lewis Dartnell is a professor in science communication at the University of Westminster, and he's also a best-selling author, which is a bit about what we're going to do today. So we're going to talk about Origins, which is Lewis's book, which I'm sure many of you might have already read. I read it and I folded down so many pages on how relevant it was to geography. So this book is basically about how the world made us, and I mean, yeah, wow, what a book. There's so much in geography that it links to, and we often talk about the idea of synopticity when lots of things link together, and so it brings kind of human and physical geography together and draws on many aspects, and it's in one accessible form. So whether you're a teacher and you want to include it in your lessons, or you're a student and you've read it, then hopefully this will be really, really useful. Or if you're a guest just watching it as well and want to find out a bit more, then this is the interview to watch for you. So we're going to go on to a few different questions, but if you do have any individual questions that you also want to ask Lewis, just please write them in the chat on the side. But if I first hand over to Lewis, could you please tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about kind of how you came to write Origins, really?
Yeah, so as you said, Ellie, I'm currently a professor at the University of Westminster, and my role at the university there is split quite nicely, 50-50, between doing my research and being in the lab, working with my PhD students in a relatively new field of science called astrobiology, which is all about looking for the possibility of there being life beyond the Earth. So I spend most of my time thinking about our next door neighbour planet, Mars, and whether there might be hardy bacteria surviving in the desert surface soil of Mars. And if there is simple life there, how would you find it? What instrument, what experiment would you strap on the front of your Mars rover to look for life? So that's half of what I do. And alongside all that research, as you said, Ellie, I do a lot of communication, public engagement, outreach, bits and pieces of TV work and radio and broadcast and journalism and writing, including writing books about things that I get excited about. And my previous book, The Knowledge, was how you could reboot civilization after an apocalypse. Let's imagine someone's pushed a great big reset button and everything's disappeared, and you're trying to work out how to go and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, how to do like Minecraft for real, and rebuild the world as we know it, but from the ground up, with all the science and technology you need to know. That was The Knowledge, and the book we're talking about today is Origins, the new book, which is all about how the Earth has shaped human history. What are the links from geography and landscapes and geology and the atmosphere and the oceans to the grand themes and trends of human history, right from the very beginning of our story and the origins of humans as a species, what made us so intelligent, for example, and then sweeping through the thousands and thousands of years of history to look at how we've been shaped and molded and influenced by the world that we live in, by the world around us.
And I think that your previous book, it's probably very relevant for today on like rebuilding societies as well. So I haven't actually read that one, but I am really, really intrigued to go and read that next. And just how to
page one. Page one of The Knowledge is, imagine there's been a global pandemic which has collapsed civilization, and I just feel a little bit uncomfortable with how prescient part of that in chapter.
Brilliant.
but it was written long before COVID became a thing.
So maybe that is, we can read it and then maybe have another live interview about that to maybe see how people respond to change and like instability. So today, we are going to talk about origins. And as you said, you mentioned so many things in the books. And a lot of it, one massive theme that comes up a lot is tectonics, but you also go on and we will ask questions about kind of climate change, the atmosphere, so many difficult models, which I find teaching when we have A Level GCSE students, like introducing the global atmospheric circulation model, like you introduce it so clearly and then show the links across. So we've got a few questions based on this, and to kind of understand kind of from huge timescales how important geographical features and, as I said, geology come to shape us. So if we start with kind of tectonics, as I said, it kind of comes through your book in many different chapters and different areas, and we can see lots of links. You've said that like we are the children of plate tectonics, and I know that has a very broad question, but I was wondering if you could expand on what you mean by this, by maybe giving us some examples.
Yeah, so one of these like deep links that I draw out across the chapters of the book is this theme of plate tectonics and all the different ways that it's affected humans throughout our story over the thousands of years and indeed the millions of years since our evolution. And the first chapter of Origins looks at where we came from, how the Earth made us as a species when we were evolving in East Africa, and then specifically in this strange tectonic environment of the Great Rift Valley, of this, what's effectively a tectonic fracture, where the skin of the planet itself, the crust of the Earth, is split open with this huge tectonic upheaval in East Africa, where our ancestors were living about 5 million years ago. And so one of the main questions that people have been exploring in recent years is, what was it about the Rift Valley, the East African Rift, where we were growing up and developing as a species and other human-like species, other hominin species in our evolutionary tree? Why did that drive us to become so intelligent? What was it about that environment that created humans as an intelligent, tool-using, chatty kind of ape? And the answer that's been emerging of recent years is that there's a unique combination of planetary forces, planetary influences in East Africa when we were living there, when we were evolving there, which is the interaction between the tectonic environment, this Rift Valley, and a system of lakes that exist along the floor of the Rift Valley, and how they are incredibly sensitive, that the levels of those lakes are incredibly sensitive to even small fluctuations in the amount of rainfall in the area, which ultimately comes to the Milankovitch cycles, to these wobbles in Earth's spin and the axis and the orbit around the sun. So it's part cosmic influence, part plate tectonic influence that created this wildly fluctuating, unstable climate in East Africa, which is what we evolved our intelligence to. We evolved big brains as an answer to the problem of how do you survive in this unpredictable environment. And then we walked out of East Africa. We dispersed around the world during the last great ice age and took those big brains that had been created by this unstable environment in East Africa and developed agriculture and farming and civilization, and the whole of human history came out of that original fact, that original process.
And when we're talking about this, just for kind of students who are maybe listening to this as well, could you just give us an idea of what kind of timescales when we talk about the kind of tectonic and the human evolution, maybe that is linked to it?
Yeah, so roughly we're talking about a time period of around 5 million years. So the last common ancestor between our lineage, between the human hominin lineage and chimpanzees, was about 7 million years ago. And over that time, when we've been developing this evolutionary tree in East Africa, we've been seeing more and more human-like species. The sort of features, the evolutionary adaptations that we have today emerged over that period. And we also see the archaeological and the paleontological evidence for the invention of fire and its use as a tool itself. So all of that story of our evolution was playing out in East Africa and then down the African continent towards South Africa over the last few million years, until eventually around 200,000 years ago, sort of modern humans appeared. Something you could dig up a skeleton of someone that lived 200,000 years ago and would have no way of telling if that was a skeleton 200,000 years old or someone that died yesterday, just by looking at the bones and the anatomy.
And you talked about how kind of humans spread across the world, and if we kind of turn to that idea of climate change and how our climate has been changing as well, we know that obviously we're in a time of rapid warming, but long-term climate change shows that we have had these glacial and interglacial periods. How has what influence has climate change had on human evolution?
Yeah, so I mean, we're all familiar with the current process of climate change, which is undeniably happening. It's undeniably caused by humans. It is our fault. We are driving that process. But actually, the Earth's climate at the moment is in an uncharacteristically cold period of the Earth's climatic history. And over about the last 40 million years, the Earth's been getting progressively colder and colder and colder. And a lot of this links to the formation of the Himalayan mountain range and various geological processes, and the rocks interacting with the atmosphere, interacting with the climate systems in those ways. Until a few million years ago, we slipped into this sort of spasming climactic period where the Earth's climate has been swinging wildly back and forth between periods of the deep freeze, of an ice age, and then an interglacial, a warmer period in between ice ages. And one of the things I talk about in the book, in Origins, is how the last ice age provided us with an opportunity. It allowed our ancestors to migrate and disperse around the entire world. We walked out of Africa and came to colonize pretty much all the land, all the big bits of land around the planet. And specifically with the last ice age, we were able to walk, because the sea levels were so low, walk across the sea-floor, areas of the sea-floor that are now dry land. So we're able to walk down towards Australasia, across the Sunderland Bridge. And then most importantly for subsequent human history, we could walk from Siberia across into Alaska and the Americas. And whereas we encountered other human-like species who'd migrate out of Africa earlier, Neanderthals, when our ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas, we were the first human species to ever have laid foot, to ever have set foot and trod in the Americas. And then as the last ice age thawed out and we entered the current interglacial period, sea levels rose again and this Bering Land Bridge was swallowed and disappeared beneath the waves again. And so these two great populations of humanity in Eurasia and the Americas became severed from each other, became separated, and we began these independent experiments in agriculture and farming and cities and civilization until around the late 1400s, 1500s, humans with the Europeans invented sailing ships that could travel across the Atlantic and re-establish that contact between these two human populations. So it was the Ice Age that gave us the opportunity to migrate around the world, and particularly to get into the Americas. But when you look at the whole, basically all of history, the whole story of humans stopping being hunter-gatherers and settling down in the same place and building villages and towns and cities and inventing and developing civilization, all of those thousands of years of what we call history has been like a click of the fingers during this current interglacial period since the last ice age. And we've spent our vast majority as humans as hunter-gatherers. So civilization is this weird period that we're going through at the moment because the environment is allowing us this opportunity to farm and have agriculture because it's very warm and very stable at the moment in this interglacial period.
And I think one thing you drew upon just there was like the importance of the oceans, and you have a whole chapter as well on the oceans, which I don't think kind of students study as much or enough at school as well. It's kind of not, I think it before we kind of deemed as not the land or not as important, but actually that is like so important as well in communication and building those networks. I mean, even as you're talking about this, I know that obviously you're like, I just wonder how you go about like learning so much about all these amazing times. I feel like you're a bit of an encyclopedia of kind of knowledge. A quick question just to put in there: how did you find like researching for this book? Is it looks that you'd already studied before?
So most of the research I did for Origins, I did new. So it links to the research that I do in astrobiology and planetary sciences and the interaction between atmosphere and geology and oceans. But the bulk of what I wrote in Origins was stuff that I researched over the course of 2-3 years when I was writing the book, by speaking to lots of really clever, really interesting people, having loads of fascinating chats with people at universities that do this research, that study this, and reading a whole bunch of material myself. So if you flick the back of Origins, the bibliography, I think something like 500, maybe 600 references that I cite there of websites or books or what we call the primary research literature, so journal papers that have been published in journals as part of academic literature. And I read a whole load of stuff to find these stories, to find these links between different features of planet Earth, different features of the world we live in, and these trends and themes through history.
One chapter I found particularly interesting was the chapter Metallic World. And I think that's probably because I haven't actually read so much kind of on those minerals. And I teach it at A Level as well, and I'm sure many students might have learned about it as well. But particularly in the ancient world, there was just a handful of metal available. So you talk about kind of copper and zinc and bronze in items, iron in steel tools, and precious metals and jewellery and currency. But today our use of metals is huge. And as you said in your book, there's kind of in one phone, there's over 60 metals, like in a handheld device. So why has like our use of metals like increased? Do you think that we're using them at an unsustainable rate?
Yeah, so that was one of my favourite stories in Origins, was that story of how we've changed our usage of things we can find in the natural world around us, things we can dig up and smelt ore to make metal. And the earliest metal, first metal we started using for tools and weapons and things, was bronze, as you say, a metal mixture of copper and tin. The problem with that, though, is, again, going back to the geography, that there are few places around the world where copper has become concentrated in deposits, in ores that you can mine, and it's worthwhile trying to mine to get the metal out. Because copper is deposited in hydrothermal vents in the middle of the seafloor. So it's hard. There's a rare geological process that scoops up some of that oceanic crust with hydrothermal vents on it and dumps it onto the land where people can at it. And so looking at the history of the Bronze Age, there's few places where copper and tin are available that dictated the whole story of where empires rose and fell and where they were trading. But with the beginning of the Iron Age, iron is a harder metal to smelt. You have to get a much hotter fire in your furnace to get the pure metal out of the kind of gacky rock that it's been bonded in. But once you've worked out how to do that, once you've had that technological revolution, it's almost as if iron is a democratic metal. It's all over the planet. It's all over the place. And I describe in Origins where all the iron that we mine throughout history has come from. And it comes from a very weird period of Earth's history, about 2.4 billion years ago, a long, long time, very early in Earth's history, when there was no oxygen in the air. That was the period when iron was being laid down. But once you can mine iron and know how to smelt it, you can use it for everything. It's useful for tools and plowshares and all the kind of weapons and armor and things. Whereas bronze, because it was so rare and therefore expensive, only the elite got to use it. Only the emperors and their armies could use bronze. But once you've got iron and steel, everyone in society gets. Yes. So we've got not just a handful of metals, not just gold and silver, which are used for coins, and iron, which is used for tools and metal, and tin has got useful properties as well. We now use 40, 50, 60 different metals, and particularly for their electronic properties. So they make very powerful and tiny magnets for the vibrating motor in your phone, or they have different electronic functions and properties that we use in smartphones and iPads and cameras and things, digital cameras. And most of those metals are known as rare earth elements. And it turns out that about 80% of the world's supply of these rare earth elements that the modern world is built out of come from China. China is dominating the world supply of these rare earth elements at the moment. So it's basically the same story all over again. In the Bronze Age, in 3000 BC, 2000 BC, it was cultures like the Minoans and the Phoenicians who dominated supply of this wonder material, which was bronze. Nowadays, in 2021, it's China dominating the supply of different metals, of these rare earth elements that we don't make, swords out of, we make iPhones out of, but they're still dominating that technological metal that we need to use. So it's one of these examples where there's this fascinating link between the geography and the way the world works today in terms of the sort of geopolitics with the sort of stories that you read about in the newspaper in the mornings or you find on your phone on bbc.com or whatever that are being dictated by the geography. There's often the geography behind the scenes of stuff we watch on TV or we read about in the newspapers.
And I think that's one reason why, just to draw on something you said right at the beginning, because then we talk about China, even talking about how I asked you a question about minerals and then you started speaking about copper and how that is linked to our geology as well and the tectonic plates. And I think that if you're looking for an example of like synopticity, that is why like your book is so great for like people just to really get thinking and drawing links. Often when we teach geography, we teach them in like isolated units, and it's only when students get to kind of sixth form do they really see those links. So I think that's a really good example of what you talked about at the beginning. I completely agree. The China having that geopolitical influence, it can mean that some countries' economy who export metals go into decline if China doesn't have as high a demand anymore. So kind of how we are so dependent on trade.
Yeah, but also it's not just China providing the rare earth elements that are making the modern world, the world that we're building out of. There's a lot of kind of geographical issues, geographical concerns about where other metals come from, like cobalt, for example, coming out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where it's being mined in pretty unpleasant conditions, kind of child labour and people not being protected when they expose themselves to this quite nasty material that they're mining. And all of this is geography again. It's what does the world need to run? What do people want? Where do you get that around the world? And how is that affecting different people's lifestyles? It's the human geography interacting with the physical geography in things that we take for granted, like say reaching out your mobile phone from your pocket.
Yeah, and I think, as you completely agree. And then the kind of consumer society as well. So people have a new iPhone and then might get another one and not really think about where that goes, but actually whether we can recycle these, like that high rate of consumption that we've currently got. Are we reusing these metals in a sustainable way? It's really interesting to think about. Yeah. We talked a little bit about, we mentioned a little bit about geopolitics there. And you talk about trade a lot and how kind of human civilizations started to kind of form connections around the world. And trade has obviously led to a more globalized world, but like through any trade, we've been kind of globalized for a really long time. It's just those connections between different places. And particularly talk about the influence of the Silk Road, so an ancient network of trade routes. So how does physical geography, again, linking that kind of physical and human, how does physical geography influence these trading routes and potentially lead to empire growth?
Yes, I think we've actually got a picture of this, something, Ellie. Is that something you can put up on the screen?
I'll put that up now.
So for those of you watching, the picture you're about to see is one of a whole stack of figures out of the book Origins, where I battled with my editor, who eventually said, "Look, mate, there's not much you can do on a page, on a piece of paper for the book. This will have to do." So my inner nerd, who I got completely into cartography and map making when I was researching and writing Origins, and particularly for the sort of talks I do at schools, where I can use PowerPoint in ultra high definition, full color graphics, I went totally overboard in terms of recreating these maps. And so the one you should be able to see at the moment is of Asia, across the backbone of Eurasia and the continent, showing the route of the Silk Roads. So going back originally to about 200 AD, when there was the Roman Empire taking over most of the continent of Europe on the western extremity of Asia, and then the Han Dynasty Chinese Empire right on the other side, in the far east of China. And these two great empires with about the same amount of land area that they'd expanded to include, about the same population, were aware of each other on opposite ends of the continent. And through a whole series of middlemen and merchants doing different trade routes, different steps along this sprawling trade network across Central Asia, exchange things like coral, minerals, dyes, pigments, silk, porcelain. Although it's called the Silk Road, there's a whole load of different stuff that was traded across there, as well as other things being moved around between people, other ideas and philosophies and religions and technology being traded across the Silk Roads. But one of the things I talk about in the book in Origins is how the physical geography of the continent of Asia have been important for where those Silk Roads, where those routes went, and therefore which colonies and trading stations they included. And if you look at the map in particular, of course, you've got the Himalayas. It's a great big towering wall of a mountain chain, which you have to find particular passes that you can get down into India to trade with India, going through the Khyber Pass, for example. But also in this part of the world, and partly because of the Himalayas and the rain shadow behind big mountain ranges, there's a lot of very arid areas in Asia, across the backbone of the continent. And so these Silk Roads had to go around the outside of these deserts. This is when they were using camels for particular steps of the Silk Road, until they start heading out towards the west, towards the Black Sea, and then the coast of the Mediterranean. So there's this web of trade routes draped across the physical geography of Asia, and it's the landscape that was dictating where people could move easily and where there were barriers and blocks that not only tradespeople and merchants can go, but also armies find it hard to move between, which clearly has a big impact on the fate of different civilizations in relation to each other, but also where people can move when they're migrating around the world. Again, there's this deep link between the human world, the human geography, through time, through history, and that physical aspect of the earth.
And just to say again, just to everybody listening, if you do have any questions, please do put them in the chat. I've got a question based on that. We talked about a lot about how physical and human geography link, and the importance of, say, physical geography for trade. Do you think technology is overcoming the barriers of physical geography? How do you think technology is changing that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, it is a good question, and I think to a large extent that's true. I mean, in the olden days, last year before the pandemic hit, you could hop in onto an airplane and soar high above any mountain range, any kind of physical barrier on the surface of the earth, and effectively teleport yourself between remote parts of the planet, and in a way that people wouldn't even dreamt about 100 years in the past. We've conquered geography in that sense of making transport rapid and relatively cheap. And it's not just hopping on a flight and flying on holiday. It's the shipping lanes. It's moving produce around the world, so it might be cheaper to make something in one part of the world and then ship it round the planet to sell on the high street in Britain. So in that sense, the physical constraints of the planet's geography are less important, less critical than they would have been in 1400 AD with the... But on the other hand, like I said, it's the same story. It's history repeating itself, it's geography repeating itself. And the situation we find today with the geopolitics of China and rare earth elements is the same story as the Iron Age, the same story as the Bronze Age. So you do see these repeating themes coming up again and again, recurring through history. Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a question come through saying, have you got any ideas for your next book? I'm sure this book took you a very long time to write.
You're starting to sound like my editor, the publisher, hassling me for, where is this manuscript, Lewis? So I'm in the middle of researching and writing the new book. And this one is looking a bit more, so still taking what I describe or is described as a big history, a sort of very top-down look, very broad look at the human story, human history, the story of science and technology, and how the world around us that we live in today came to be. How do we build it? And I mentioned earlier that my last book, The Knowledge, was how you could reboot civilization from scratch in a sort of Walking Dead scenario after some kind of apocalypse, which is basically just a conceit. It's a way of asking the question, how could you go right back to basics and reinvent all the science and technology that we take for granted today? How could you accelerate your passage back to the history of science and technology? Whereas Origins is much more about how was the stage of the Earth important in that same story, the story of human development. And what I'm doing with the new book is looking at how biology is important in this story, how different aspects of humans as an animal has been important in our capabilities and our constraints, and how that has played out across time, across history. So, it's sort of different aspects, different viewpoints on the same general idea of how do we get to here, how do we get to today.
I have another just quick question, because lots of things in your book I was like, that's just really, really interesting. I think one part also was when you talked about the Mediterranean and the different coastlines around there, so how you're going to explain it a bit better, obviously, but how like in Italy and around Europe, there's like different jaggedy coastlines so that you can have trade and also harbours and forts, whereas along that coastline in Africa, it's much more plain, and there wasn't the geography to be able to maybe make those trade networks. And I was wondering what that was the most kind of interesting thing you learnt from the book, or just even maybe the most interesting chapter or part that really caught, obviously the whole book caught your interest, but really caught your interest even more.
Yeah, so that story about the Mediterranean, and why was it, for thousands of years of history, why was it the northern coastline of this oval-shaped inland sea, the Mediterranean, that was so busy and so active throughout history with all these different cultures and civilizations and societies, whereas the bottom lip of the Mediterranean, the southern coastline, on the whole, was much more quiet and boring, and nothing really happened, which all comes down to plate tectonics again, and the fact that it is the continent of Africa that is being subducted beneath Europe, and therefore the northern coastline of the Mediterranean is being crumpled up in this mountain building process to create the Alps, as well as a very rugged, hilly landscape, which has created lots of archipelagos of small islands and Aegean, and a really crinkly, complicated coastline full of lots of natural harbours and bays that is very supportive of sea trade and moving things around by sea, as you say, rather than on the other hand, the North African coastline is very smooth and flat, with basically no natural harbours, barely any natural harbours for supporting societies. And in fact, there's a map of that that perhaps you could show on the screen now, or indeed, if anyone's interested, on the book's website on originsbook.com, you can follow through to the teachers links, and there's a whole PowerPoint and loads of other teaching material available that you can download for free with different aspects of of these stories. So the Mediterranean story was one that really stood out for me, because it's just something we hear so much about with the ancient Greeks and Phoenicians and Romans and Minoans, all these different civilizations. But my favourite story of all, and the one that surprised me the most when I was researching, was this deep link between the planetary and the political. How geography influences even how people vote in national elections, in general elections, who you want your leader to be, who you want the president to be. An example that I gave, and again I think that there's a map that we can show here, was of the presidential elections in the United States, and specifically the southern states, which on the whole, not surprisingly, are a massive Republican area. People have tended to vote Republicans in recent decades, in places like Florida and South Carolina. But running through this political map, running through the sea of red voting counties, is a very distinct, very clear, thin crescent of Democrat voting, blue voting southern states of America, which is weird because it doesn't correlate, doesn't correspond to anything you can see on the map or see in the landscape. It's not following the banks of the Mississippi. It's not following the outline of a chain of mountains or a range of hills. And it's only when you look at a geological map, you can peel off a landscape map and look at a geological map, the rocks underground. And you notice that rocks that are about 75 million years old match perfectly with this band of Democrat voting counties. And the reason for this, the reason that people tend to vote Democrats, they voted for Biden, they voted for Hillary Clinton in the previous election against Trump, in that particular arc, isn't of course directly because they got 75 million rocks in their backyard, in their back garden, because these people aren't geologists. They're not being told who to vote for by the rocks. But what there is this really satisfying, this really fascinating chain of cause and effect, with one thing leading to the next, reaching back through centuries of human history and then millions of years of the planet's history. And that band of rocks, this Cretaceous rocks, laid down in a chapter of Earth's history called Cretaceous, is basically seafloor mud. The Earth's sea levels were much, much higher back in the Cretaceous. And it was realised in the mid-1800s that where that rock has eroded out of the ground and produced soil, it gives you a really rich, fertile, dark soil, a soil that is perfect for growing cash crops like cotton, to sell back to Europe for money that you can then buy things you need in the colonies. And unfortunately, in that period of history, growing cotton meant slave labour. People were abducted, kidnapped and thrown in chains in Africa, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean following the trade winds, which was another chapter I talk about in Origins, and then forced to work as slaves on these plantations growing cotton. And still today, hundreds of years after the Civil War and the emancipation from slavery and the civil rights movement, still today the greatest concentration of Black African American people live along that particular band of Cretaceous age rocks, 75 million year old rocks. And these are people that unfortunately still suffer from human geographical factors, socioeconomic deprivation, that they have poor access to healthcare, poor access to education, poor salaries, poor opportunities, and therefore people which are more likely to vote for Democrat political promises, political ideals, rather than Republican. So it's again this deep link operating across many different levels of economics, mineral resources, or agriculture, of economies, then going back down to more fundamental underlying causes like the geology, the rocks under your feet, and how the planet has changed over millions of years. So that I found was the most satisfying story that I found out when I was researching for this book, and then got to tell by showing all the maps of things layering on top of each other in the book in Origins.
Yeah, and I think that really shows the power of how things, aspects that happened so long ago in the past can really impact our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, still affects us today.
Brilliant. There's one kind of question, and someone just Ines just said thanks. That's a really interesting point as well. How would you say? And this is from Aidan saying, how would you say biology and geography relate and affect each other? Sorry, it's a big question. You can take it. So as you mentioned earlier, one clear way is that geography affects evolution and how species develop. So are there any other factors?
Yeah, so again, the geography and the biology is very deeply related. It's not just evolution driving the origin of new species and how they adapt to different environments. One of the central points of biology is different animals, different plants being adapted to different biomes, different ecosystems. And basically, an ecosystem is completely determined by the geography. Is it high altitude or is it coastal? Is it tidal? Is it warm? Is it cold? What is the annual rainfall? And all of these things are geographical features. They are planetary features. And I do talk about that aspect of geography as well in Origins, in particular, how you have stripes of different climate bands running along the width of Eurasia again. And how, for example, the great civilisations of China, India, Central Asia, all along the southern coastline, basically, the southern margin of Eurasia, because that is where it is rainy enough, it's wet enough to be able to feed yourself through farming, through agriculture. You can grow crops reliably and not starve to death. And further to north, running right down the backbone of Eurasia, further north than the band of the Silk Roads we saw, is an ecological band, a climate band known as the steppes, where it is dry, so dry that trees can't grow, and it's this huge swaying grassland. And the lifestyle that people adopt to survive in the steppes is one of nomadic pastoralism. You are constantly moving around with a huge flock of livestock, goats or sheep or cattle, and allowing the animals to eat the grass, which humans can't eat, but we can eat the animals that have eaten the grass. And one of the central themes for thousands and thousands of history, thousands of years of history, has been that friction between these two fundamental different lifestyles of how humans live, of being pastoralist and nomadic, or being settled and agricultural. And all of this story of things like the Mongol hordes and the building of the Mongol Empire, or the collapse of the Roman Empire by the Huns and other nomadic people spilling out of the steppes, is a story of ecology. It's a story of climate bands. It's a story of humans migrating when the conditions change around them. And there's a chapter that explores that deep link between ecology and climate bands and these physical aspects of physical geography.
And thank you for the question. That was a really, really interesting one. We, to kind of round up, we ask all of our guests this, a bit of kind of career advice for students watching.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of, how did you get to where you are? Were you always interested in kind of like understanding kind of the world around us since you were younger? Could you give some kind of tips for students and kind of knowing for how did you get to where you are, really?
Yeah, so I've always been a bit of a nerd. I've always been interested in things around me. But curiously, I didn't do geography, or in fact history, at GCSE or A Level. I was a scientist. I did 3 sciences and maths at A Level, and then read biological sciences at university before getting involved in astrobiology and aspects of planetary science. So I think the sort of take-home message from my career is often it doesn't really matter what you do at university or what you do for A Level, because you can always branch out and move around between different areas afterwards. You can often teach yourself or learn the skills that you need slightly later in life when you realise they're interesting or useful to you. But of course, it is still important to say that working hard at school is the key to that. You know, it's finding whatever it is that you are passionate about and then excelling at that. That's nailing those things to then build a career out of and enjoy doing it, enjoy what you do.
And before we go, I've just put the link out on the chat as well so teachers can see kind of the resources. I know you kind of mentioned them before, but would you like to let teachers know how they can easily kind of use your book in the classroom? I was saying to you earlier that sometimes it's great having a book, but you're like, how do I put that into the classroom? Or it takes loads more extra work. But you've actually already helped teachers so much. So I was wondering if you could just share that quickly.
Yeah, so on that teachers focused part of the book's website, so it's teachers.originsbook.com. There's a whole bunch of different resources that I've been working on since the book came out. There's all of these high quality maps in a PowerPoint file that you're welcome to use in any way you like during your teaching, which if you read the book will make most sense because you'll see how I've described and explained and drawn the links between different aspects of geography for those maps. But also there's a big long document which links between different parts of the book that explain and discuss different aspects of the course syllabus, of what topics you might want to cover in your class. So you can look up a particular topic and see where in the book I describe that, and therefore what graphics and maps it links to. And one thing I'm very keen on working on much more now, and if any teachers listening are interested in working with me on this, I would love to put out a couple more of focused handouts or teacher resources, teacher documents, where everything's kind of laid out step by step in a worksheet for a particular area of geography, and giving the graphics and a set of questions that can be used. There's one or two up there already. I've got a couple I've been working on to do with tectonics, earthquakes, climate change, and Milankovitch cycles. But it'd be much easier to work with a geography teacher that was possible for you guys in the classroom, and provide that as a resource that is handy.
Brilliant. And they can just get into contact with you via your email, which is on your website. Yeah,
so my email's on the website. It's lewis@lewisdartnell.com. Genuinely, I would be delighted if you ping me an email, reach out, say hi, and let me know what you're interested in and what we can do together. I'd really love that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. You have really been a fantastic start to our series. So thank you so much for taking the time. And we have literally just touched upon some key concepts. Your book is so in depth with so many different things. I hope many people enjoy it if they haven't already read it. And yeah, so thank you very much from me. I'm just going to let our guests know what's coming up next week. So I'm just a bit flustered on where everything is. So not next week, the week after, we are joined all the way from India by a student at university who is also a climate activist, and he's going to be talking about what he feels about air pollution in India and why young people or why the world should act to reduce air pollution. So I'm super excited about that. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining. And yeah, that's it from me. Hope everybody is doing well during lockdown at the moment, and I look forward to seeing you for our next live interview. Okay, that's it from me.